brought to court for trying to help refugees, and we weren't allowed to mention any of it, not a single thing, because it's a tradition in the EU that we don't name member states or list abuses. So we have a fundamental rights report that deals with abuses in the European Union, but actually doesn't deal or address any of them. And to me, and we had a battle on this, which we lost, is it any wonder the situation isn't improving? Because if you can't acknowledge it, then you can't deal with it. And what makes it even more sickening is the fact that every month, month after month in the plenary, MEPs queue up to talk about human rights abuses in Russia, in China, in some global south country, anywhere outside of the EU. And there's a real reticence to address the problems within its borders, with the exception maybe of when they're talking about Poland and Hungary. There isn't an appetite to accept that rights across the EU are going backwards. And I think Poland and Hungary is an interesting one as well, because the narrative is kind of put out that they're a bit of an outlier, like, you know, that we need to bring them back into the fold. They've been very bold and are really letting the side down. And obviously what's going on in Poland and Hungary is utterly shocking in terms of judicial interference, attacks on the LGBTI community and so on. But to me, they are kind of the Donald Trump of the EU. They're not actually that different. They're just the ugly, blunt face of the same system that's going on in other member states. Because let's look at France. You know, we don't think of France as liberty, fraternity, equality and all of that, great freedom and defenders of human rights. But France, following the Bataclan attacks in 2015, brought in a state of emergency for 2 years. There were judicial powers given, or exceptional power given without judicial oversight, where the authorities could search any premises that they wanted to on very, very vague grounds. And although the state of emergency is gone, actually it's been incorporated into a new anti-terrorism law that grants the police investigators extensive power to raid, detain, question terrorism suspects under the provisions. And actually the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, Finola Ní Aoláin, and she made the point that actually it's the Muslim minority community now that is being targeted as a suspect community as a result of the broad application of this law. So to me, it's not surprising that France was one of the countries that imposed successive states of emergency last year, then again, when the pandemic arose. Because, I mean, obviously it should go without saying that, of course, it can be lawful and sensible to impose the curtailment on some human rights in the interests of public health. But that must be done on the basis that the curtailment is time limited, it's necessary, and it's proportionate. But actually what happened in the EU is that a lot of measures that were brought in by member states to deal with COVID weren't necessary, they weren't proportionate, and to me, they were actually the pandemic being used as a pretext to deepen policies that countries were already pursuing. So we saw, for example, Italy and Malta declaring that their ports were unsafe during the crisis and preventing boats from disembarking with migrants, something that both countries have been wanting to do anyway. We had the Netherlands and France suspending the registration of new asylum applications, Greece imposing indefinite lockdowns on migrants in detention centres, effectively basically imprisoning them. And then there was a whole range of new surveillance implements being brought in the likes of the Netherlands, whereby a law was brought in which would force telecommunication providers to collect mobile phone location and traffic data and pass it on to the health authority, circumventing citizens' right to choose. Something similar happened in Denmark as well. So I suppose my point is that none of these measures taken in COVID were necessarily departures for the states concerned, but they were kind of outgrowths of policy directions that they were already very much there. And what we've had is a narrative of crisis and instability, which has been gripping Europe for several years now and is being used to justify all sorts of measures and slippages in rights. And Corona was just another one of those from a political establishment that really is just too eager to talk about threats and push the line on rights as a result of it. Could be migration, terror, Russia, China, anything that leads us to the place where they say exceptional measures are necessary, they're justified and legitimate, even if they quietly become permanent. So that's the backdrop here. And for me, it's a really serious situation in Europe, because if you talk crisis all the time, you're closing the space for calm and reasoned discussion. If you're responding in a securitized manner rather than a diplomatic one, then that's incredibly problematic. And it is true that our world in the West, or the more advanced countries, is unstable now in a manner in which we maybe didn't envisage previously. But actually, most of the world's population have always been living in unstable conditions, and our stability, when it was there, was really at their expense anyway. And I think one of the examples which illustrates the point very well, and I won't go on about it too much, but is what's happening around migration in Europe, is an excellent, bleak example of this terrible problem about how narratives of instability and crisis have become weaponized against fundamental rights. So we have the idea that migration is a threat. And this is one of the strongest drivers of European policy at every level. And so as a result of that, we've had Greek border guards employed by the state pushing refugees back into Turkish water, leading to those refugees drowning. We've had Croatian police authorities raping young Afghani refugees with branches of trees when they tried to enter from Bosnia. We've had Greece suspending asylum applications totally illegally. We've had the EU giving money to the Libyan Coast Guard, who are just basically lawless militias, in order to bring people trying to get to Europe back to Libya to be detained and tortured. And we had camps. The EU-Turkey deal, for example, has been described as really the end of sort of Europe's claim to have any sort of decent human rights record. And to top it all off, we have now the European Commission talking about a new migration pact, which actually just seeks to formalize all of the rights abuses that have been taking place over the last number of years anyway. And this is something that we need to strongly campaign against, because this pact is just focused on how to return migrants from where they came from. That's what it's all about. It's about getting already unsafe countries like Niger and Libya to be responsible for stopping people getting to Europe's borders in the first place. And I think we should be very, I'm going on about it a bit, but the reason why I'm doing it is that we really have to drum this issue home, because the bitter irony of it is that, you know, even in 2015, the numbers of people looking to come to Europe wasn't at a crisis level. The pushbacks that are happening now, the migration pact, and all of the terrible rights abuses that are happening, were happening in the context of the first half of 2020, which saw just 55,000 people arrive in the EU via irregular migration channels. Now, that's half the amount of people who passed through Dublin Airport on a sunny day pre-COVID times. So what we're seeing here is the strength of the narrative of crisis has far outstripped the reality of the numbers getting to Europe. But what it does show us is how fragile human rights are, because we've sacrificed so many, not even because of a real crisis, but just the story of a crisis, because that's all it is. And yet many of our civil liberties have been compromised across Europe, and vast amount of our budgets have been spent in securing our borders. So why is this happening, and who's benefiting? And to me, it's very clear that there is an enormous big business lobby at the heart of the EU, led by many of the same arms companies that see a scenario whereby in the midst of a global pandemic, the EU rustles together 5 billion for the EU for Health programme, but continues during the panic to spend 8 billion on the European Defence Fund, 5 billion on the European Peace Facility, which is about allowing African countries to buy arms, ironically enough, from the EU, and 22 billion on border surveillance. So to justify all of that money when there's so much human need out there, well, then you've got to have a bogeyman. So is it migration? Is it Russia and China? The new Cold War rhetoric that's been ratcheted up here is significant. And all of this is being used to develop monumental databases interoperable across Europe with details on our citizens. We have the constant narrative of foreign interference, which is just really used to justify the fact that they can't deal with the fact that the citizens of Europe have been pretty much fed up with the establishment politics. And as a result, we've seen the likes of Brexit, the rise of the far right and so on. But rather than look at their own actions of neoliberal capitalism in Europe, they look to blame foreign interference and so on. And we have now the weaponization of human rights, with human rights being used to justify interventions in countries that we really have no business in. It is the modern day colonialism. And I think this dominance by powerful vested private interests is one of the key blockages to our rights in all aspects of our lives. Because, you know, I know you had wanted to talk about the pandemic, and, you know, that is an unprecedented health crisis because of the way in which it's morphed into an economic crisis. But one of the reasons why that's happened is because of private ownership of medicine production. I mean, I'm amazed at the narrative in Ireland about the row between the EU countries and Britain and so on over the vaccines being produced by the big pharma companies. And it's like the rich countries fighting over this product, when actually our attention should be on the fact that what we need on a global scale is the mass production of vaccines. And the only way in which that can be done is by tackling the intellectual property rights and the private ownership of medicine production, which is allowed for in the rules of the World Trade Organization. But the EU and the wealthy countries are blocking the initiatives of South Africa and India to have that virus, not only making all of us unsafe and obviously leading to the deaths of people in the global south, but to me, it's a good example, if you like, of the root of the problems, that people's right, their right to health, their right to life in many ways cannot be vindicated at the moment, not because science hasn't developed the answers, because it has, but the property rights of that answer is in the hands of companies who want to retain it for their own private gain rather than for the good of humankind. And the EU, who you'd think would be championing this, is instead relying on a sort of a charity provision of a donation of 20 million vaccines under the COVAX scheme to the global south, but actually blocking the lifting of that TRIPS waiver and being to the forefront in international trade talks, enforcing global south countries to adopt intellectual property rights protections which deny them access to medicine and other products going into the future. And I think, so to me, you can't divorce the struggle for rights from that situation. And, you know, we talk about reducing poverty, and, you know, it's true that poverty rates in some ways have reduced, but actually the numbers in poverty globally has gone up. It's an interesting point that maybe some people want to develop, that actually the places where the most progress have been made in terms of reducing poverty has been firstly in China, and secondly in countries in Latin America which rejected American interventionism and went a different path. And presumably these countries would be countries that wouldn't be in the 8% of the countries that we would call fully fledged democracies. And yet they have been able to address some of the economic rights of people a bit better by a state-led industrial policy, by protectionism and regulation and so on, actions which allowed our economies to develop years ago, but which the West has been instrumental in keeping the global south imprisoned by. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that the truth is you can't vindicate human rights unless you deal with economic and social rights. And I think in that sense, Ireland has been particularly badly exposed in the present situation. I mean, it is the case that the idea of human rights as international and indivisible is really only a recent thing. It only dates back to about 1948 and so on, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But before that, you had the struggle for human rights around issues like the Magna Carta in Britain, which put limits on royal government in England in the 13th century. We had the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of Rights of Man. And these were obviously landmarks, but they showed how revolutionary visions could be transformed into national law and made effective, if you like, under the law in guaranteeing against future abuses. It might be an interesting point to discuss that under a global neoliberal capitalist system, will the idea of international human rights ever be only an aspiration? I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. I think that's true because of the private ownership at the helm. But what the struggle for human rights in nation states previously has shown us is that these rights haven't been granted by benevolent rulers. They've been fought for by citizens. And that's really the way in which the progress will develop over the foreseeable future. When we look at the situation in Europe with the rights being undermined, the attacks, so one of the few examples against that trend was the struggle for abortion rights in Ireland, which was ultimately victorious a number of years ago. But we also see the whip of that kind of counter-revolution in Poland, where the restrictions being imposed there have unleashed a massive positive movement there. So when we look to dealing with the situation of human rights in an unstable world, we need to deal with all of those issues as well. So I take it that cough is telling me to shut up. So I'll shut up now without even mentioning climate change and lead the way for a few questions. Then I've no idea of the time I spent, and I'm sorry if I went over.
Thank you, Claire. That was your timekeeping was perfect, and that was a purely non-intervention chairman cough, I promise you. Thank you very much indeed. That was very comprehensive. Also, quite alarming. I think you spoke quite a lot about. You said you weren't going to, but you spoke quite a bit about COVID actually, and you illustrated how the emergency, the lockdown, whatever, has been used as a pretext to sort of further strengthen long-standing authoritarian trends in our society. Without wanting to, appear, unduly idealistic or something, could one see, you looked at the COVID as a threat. Could you also see the COVID as a pretext, as an argument for solidarity, self-interested solidarity in some ways, on the basic thing made very, very clear, I think, that, my neighbor, your health is very important for my health. And that, the interconnectedness of our societies, of human rights, economic well-being and so on, that, the rationale for solidarity, the rationale for social progress, progress in healthcare, I'm answering also my own question. Have you any thoughts on that? How
yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen is kind of contradictory developments, really, haven't we? Because when the pandemic arose, there was a sort of an instinct of solidarity amongst people. We had the appreciation of frontline workers and, shop workers and so on, who previously would have been given a very raw deal in society. But we had a lot of talk about solidarity at EU level. But the fact of the matter was that EU countries closed their borders. They kept their own stock of protective gear for themselves, and they basically ran for the hills. So, I mean, I think it is true that solidarity is the only way. And I think probably in terms of the hearts and minds and people now are being engaged around this issue of the private ownership of medicine production, for example, is definitely in a place where people who would never have thought about that before have to give that consideration. But we need the spotlight spun on it a bit more, because the Corporate Observatory Europe, who do an awful lot of good work, they're an NGO here who expose a lot about what's going on at the heart of the EU, have unearthed the fact that all of the EU's member states have been complicit in that situation, in forcing global south countries to adapt intellectual property rights ownership in various trade deals, and restricting their ability to develop the type of solidarity that you were talking about in the area of medicine production. It's absolutely abhorrent, and the only reason they've done that is at the behest of big pharma. But I mean, I think we've got to capture the facts now are more in the hearts and minds of people. So we've got to work on that, popularize those ideas, expose more that you know, this has to be tackled, and I think there'll be fertile ground for that, because as you say, if we don't inoculate the whole of the world, well then, you know, we're going to be less safe. So even being selfish in our solidarity, it makes sense.
Okay. There was a question coming through on the chat line here from Donald Shea. Was wondering about the role that the European Parliament can play for the civil rights of disabled people, not least in the context of the, you know, less than satisfactory situation in our country and the very slow progress in the current eruptus in the development of that. Any thoughts on that, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the things I found being over here is that there is a huge amount of talk of rights in the European Union, and there would be, you know, a lot of talk about disability rights and so on. There would be motions passed in the Parliament. The way the work is organised here, it's organised through committees. So if you're not on a committee, you maybe wouldn't have the input into that committee. So disability rights would a little bit come under the Civil Liberties Committee that I'm under, but it is in general as well a member state prerogative. And that's not me making an excuse saying, oh, blame Ireland, but actually it would be dealt with as a sort of a health issue as well and come under health budgets, which are national prerogative. But there's a huge amount of talk in terms of access and anti-discrimination and that. And in fairness to the EU, at least on paper, they probably did develop good policies on this. The problem has been the lack of implementation of them by member states. And while we can blame member states, in part, it's the neoliberalism being propounded by the EU that has prevented member states from implementing these policies. So we saw, for example, the strain on our health services and our social protection budgets, but we saw that it was the EU pushing member states to cut back austerity to keep in with the fiscal rules and so on. So it's a kind of a catch-22. But these issues are debated a lot. Unfortunately, we've obviously, like everywhere else, been in lockdown here for the past year. So a lot of the events and that we could have organised, brought people over, hearings that we could have had, haven't taken place because the Parliament is basically closed off to outsiders, more or less, you know. So that's an awful pity. But there have been a lot of events around disability concerns. It does get featured as one of the few, but you know, as I say, not enough. It's mentioned in the Fundamental Rights Report and all that, and they'll say all the right things, but you know, the devil is in the details, and you need economic resources to bring in policies that allow that to be developed.
Talking about devilish details, one of the hailed successes of the European Parliament in the last 5 years has been this data protection legislation. I'm not sure of your views on this, but I saw quite recently there's been some calls from some of your fellow MEPs, perhaps not from your group, wondering, this legislation is 3-4 years old. Is it fit for purpose given the rapidly changing world? There are various aspects to that, and but of course the particular issue, again with the COVID thing, the issue of health data, the track and trace activities. Does the employer have right to take your temperature and presumably code in your temperature? Have you any thoughts on that? I know it's a very, very big question, very, very complex.
It's an absolutely huge issue over here, and it would be a giant topic for the Libe Civil Liberties Committee that I'm a member on. There isn't a meeting that doesn't go by that big data isn't discussed in it in one way or another. And you're totally right. Like the GDPR legislation was a huge positive in terms of at least putting in place a framework for protection of privacy data and so on. And when you contrast that with the enormous big interoperable database projects that they're also developing, gathering data, it makes the GDPR even more important, you know. At the moment, this week, there's a plenary now starting this afternoon and tomorrow. And one of the big issues on that will be the beginning of the discussion around this digital vaccination passport, which touches on a lot of the issues you were talking about apps, trace and all of that. I think in fairness, the Parliament would be pretty okay on this. We'd be very cautious. The Parliament is demanding the right to scrutinise this. This has incredibly serious civil liberties implications. I mean, I'm all for opening up safe travel and so on. I come from an aviation background, former Aer Lingus worker. I know our aviation workers are on their knees and stuff, but this vaccination passport is very dangerous. I think the Commission realises that, like, so they're saying there's no talk of just a vaccination. They're talking about a document that would allow you, where you could show that you're not a danger to public health. So you could have had a test, or, you know, you could have had COVID before, or you may have opted for a vaccine. Any talk about compelling that type of health information and member states allowing it to be used just on a vaccine, I don't think will be tolerated by the EU. But it's huge, and it's huge. There's a whole other aspect that you haven't about the role of big data and the big private companies and so on, and how much information they're accessing. But we'd be here all day on that. Luckily, there are a number of really good digital nerds in my office who love this. And actually, there's some really good people who, from some of the other political groups, there's a pirate party from Germany and the Czech Republic, but the pirates from Germany are actually, they are so good on this data stuff, and it's kind of a real niche topic. But I think the Parliament has been pretty good on safeguards in for all of those reasons, because they're, you know, data is big business now, huge, and it's definitely the future, and the way, you know, technology is developing and so on, and it comes up with every aspect of our lives, in integration across Europol, Eurojust, all of these monolithic EU organizations which are building giant computer frames, processing and accessing our data. Is pretty scary stuff, but it does get scrutinized here. But sadly, the horse is still bolting down the road, but just with a few reins on them, pulling them back in a bit.
I could just read a couple of the questions coming in here. One from Dan McInerney. I'll read two, Claire, and you can on. Dan McInerney mentions that Claire spoke of ratcheting up of Cold War politics. Does she think it's justified or unnecessary? And Tom Cooney, the communication of an alternative vision seems to be failing as people feel personally threatened. How do you address this?
Well, just easy questions then for a Wednesday morning. Fair enough. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, look, on the Cold War thing first, no question or doubt about it. The past number of years have seen a marked change in the manner in which the EU is behaving towards Russia and to China in particular. This is very much, I suppose, on the back of the US, and Biden would have said it as well, that China is viewed as a major economic rival now to the US. Ironically, on the other side, it's the EU's now biggest trading partner. Just in the last number of weeks, it's got the #1 slot there. But we have so many committees and so many talk. People would have seen when the High Representative of the EU, Joseph Borrell, went to Russia. He'd obviously given out about the arrest of Navalny and all the rest of it, but when he came back, he got into huge trouble, which I thought was just ridiculous, because he's a diplomat, that's his job. He's supposed to be going and talking. Russia is our nearest neighbours, and I'm quite sure he would have made his views known on the matter, but that wasn't enough for the European Union. They came back and demanded more sanctions on Russia. But for what, like? What were they sanctioning them for? Like, America has sanctioned Germany for dealing with Nord Stream 2 gas. So Russia is the bogeyman every single time, without any foundation or logic or consistency in the appliance of human rights standards at all. I mean, they were all up in arms about the arrest of Navalny. There was an arrest of another leader in Georgia the following week, and no one said anything. They all said, lads, you got to sit down and talk about this. Everybody should be sitting down and being diplomatic, whereas in Russia, they ratcheted up a gear. Absolutely deliberate, totally driven by the arms industry and the securitization agenda that's around the EU. It's shocking. You could do a whole program on it. I'm not going to go on about it too much, but I sit on the Security and Defence Committee. We have these people coming in all the time talking about the Russian threat. When I raised it at the meeting that there isn't a common threat, that people in Ireland are not threatened by Russia, big Polish fella says to me, "Oh, that's all right for you. You weren't occupied by Russia for years." And I said, "Yeah, but we were occupied by Britain. And the solution to that isn't, do you want me to go out and rearm the IRA just in case they come back? No, we should be dealing diplomatically with our neighbours." And it's the same thing with Russia. But that doesn't satisfy the narrative of a lot of the Eastern European countries here. And it certainly doesn't satisfy the narrative of the arms industry, who are huge and who drive so much of the agenda here. And not only are they benefiting from the money on arms, they're also benefiting for the security contracts for the borders and the fencing and the surveillance to stop the refugees who are the victims of those wars or our climate change interventionism and colonialism in those countries. So watch out for it. And look at it. It's definitely growing. We have a committee on foreign interference as well, which talks about Russia all the time. I think in terms of the other point, it's a much more complicated question about the failure to deliver for people to, I suppose, feel an alternative vision. And I think that that's definitely true. How we deal with that is probably a much more difficult question. Sorry, I just have somebody going into the room here now with me. But yeah, I mean, what was the end of that point? It was the question that I think Dan had asked it. It was about
the alternative vision.
Yeah.
Seems to be failing as people feel personally threatened. How do you address this?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it comes back to the point you made, Donald, at the start. Like, that actually people need solidarity for survival. Like, if you're personally threatened, you need to feel that the only way for your security is to develop a relationship with your neighbour. You might say, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. But I think the first thing we've got to do is counteract the narrative. And if we look at it from the point of view of refugees and all of that, a lot of this is, oh, they're undermining our culture. They're a threat to us. They're all these borderline. We need to break down that barrier. So it's true that it's there, but yeah, I mean, who does that, or how can we do that? I mean, and who is we? I can do it, you can do it, the people here can do it, but it's very difficult for that. I suppose it only comes out of the common struggles that we engage in to vindicate our own rights, then become tied up with the rights of others in that. When we're in a lockdown scenario, as we are, and people are isolated so much in their homes, we're breaking down that social dynamic, and people are losing some of their social skills even in their isolation. So once you're at home and you're locked in, you feel more vulnerable and removed. We can only, I suppose, counteract it by information, by dialogue, and by an exchange of views and humanity. But it's very difficult to do that when people are locked down as well, so we need to be very, very mindful of those things. But yeah, I mean, it was ever so, I suppose, wasn't it? I mean, any establishment society has survived on the basis of divide and rule and making people feel that their neighbour is their enemy, whereas, cooperation and solidarity really are the antidotes to that, difficult and all as it is to address that. But I do think that the negativity or the catastrophic consequences of the pandemic and climate change have forced a rethinking that. I mean, it's much more acceptable now to understand that the idea of continuous growth is just not acceptable anymore. We were kind of brought up to believe that sort of automatically our future was going to be more secure as that of our parents, a permanent pensionable job, and that progress was going in the one direction. All of that's gone now, so people have had to look back in, and I think there is maybe a redevelopment of some of the old ways economically in terms of organic production, clean production, cooperation at more local level and so on. I think it's out of that a new sort of a solidarity will develop. But I mean he's not wrong. It's a difficult one, and it's a difficult one when the media is owned and controlled generally by those who don't want that narrative going out there, who want to maintain the idea of private ownership of the means of wealth in society, who want to maintain that divide. So that's why I suppose we're happy to have the alternative of social media outlets and other opportunities there to counteract that.
Thanks. You mentioned in your introduction that about the recent trends in global inequality and poverty, which just recently there's a report from the World Bank which showed that after decades of improved global equality, for the first time in 20 years or more, we see a radical reversal of that trend and a big increase in poverty globally in the aftermath of the recession, of the COVID recession. During the financial crisis, we didn't see this trend, but now we're seeing it very, very clearly. Of course, this puts huge, I would imagine this puts huge pressure on the whole field of human rights. Poverty and equality itself is, of course, highly connected to human rights. The issue that I was thinking of is a thing that you've touched on several times, is that this global inequality may lead to increased pressure, migratory pressures into Europe. And, again, if one were to take a more health-related view of the COVID pandemic, some sort of idea or nightmare of stigmatization of migrants in the context of being COVID infected and the human rights implications of that. Have you any thoughts about possible?
That's always a worry, and we saw it very much in the early days with the Wuhan virus and the anti-Asian rhetoric. But I mean, we even have that at the heart of the European Union, where anti-China rhetoric is alive and well. We were called panda huggers by an actual Green MEP who's the chair of the China delegation, because for trying to have a nuanced position on China, which is actually a racial and an acknowledged racial slur spoken openly in the parliament. And there are people here who would, they don't need the excuse of being worried for their health to want the borders of Europe shut up and keeping migrants out. I mean, some of the racist rhetoric that gets peddled in here by the far right, some of whom are growing in, and I think more of them will, across Europe because of the failure of the neoliberal capitalism to actually deal with the problems of citizens. People in desperation are turning to these groups, some of who have the most vile rhetoric. So that is a concern. We don't need to, I suppose, wait for that concern, because the abuse of migrants and the racism towards them is here already, and it's here in the actions of the EU and all of the issues that I outlined at the start. The amount of money that we spend on keeping them out. If we spent a fraction of it in dealing with healthcare and housing and so on, it wouldn't be a problem at all, because they have been hugely, the numbers are tiny. As I said, 55,000 people last year. As I said, statistically half of what comes through Dublin Airport in a day. But yet all of the talk, and it goes on here all the time, is that the enemy is at the gate. And it's the discussion on terror is linked always with migration, and that's stigmatizing that whole issue all the time and playing on people's fears. So that's a constant thread, and it's pushed by the EU and it's pushed by the companies that are making the money out of this as well. So yeah, unfortunately that spectre is there, and you're totally right as well. The migratory trends will continue. They won't really affect Europe that much. It's where they affect is the other parts of Africa or the Middle East or Latin America, where people move within their own continents because of climate change, because of all of these measures. But it will certainly be used in Europe for sure.
Just sticking in the theme of inequalities, which of course is the core really activity of TASC's research and action. What are your thoughts? In some respects, the economic impact of the crisis is really pretty horrendous and not really visible yet. In some respects, what are your thoughts of what the European Union can do to ameliorate the negative distribution consequences of the crisis? So certainly I presume you'd agree that in some respects the big package, I've forgotten the name now.
I've even forgotten it as well. The recovery fund.
I remember. In some respects quite impressive in the scale of resources available. How would you like this money to be spent, and other respects, how do you think the European Union can address the inequalities within Europe?
Well, it's quite a big fund, right? But about 40% of it is going to Spain and Italy, and for a very good reason, that these countries were very hardly hit. but also because I think if Italy didn't get a big chunk of money, they were going to leave the European Union, and that was going to be it. So they had no choice but to make those funds available. They are very substantial for those countries. The problem with it is what is the payback going to be on those funds? Because they're a mix of loans and grants. And those loans are coming back with serious strings attached. And we've seen that in a whole number of areas, that they are being linked to what we would have called and been through before in Ireland, the reigniting of an austerity agenda. You're not allowed to mention the word austerity here because of obviously the connotations of it. You're not allowed to mention it, but the policies are the same. And that's unfortunately going to be down the future. The payback, for example, in terms of the likes of Italy, in terms of pension reform, same in Spain, a lot of the issues that we saw in terms of what Ireland went through, that's definitely going to be a big problem. I think what they could do and what they did do was relax the fiscal rules. That was a help, and the restraints there on the economy. For me, the lesson of that should be that they should be lifted well into the future as well. There needed to be, and there was a massive injection. Some companies, the likes of France, and that I think put in about 7 billion into Air France, for example. You know, there were massive amounts of money going in. The problem was this was a golden opportunity for us to put conditions on that money to say, yes, okay, we will put this in. We want to protect jobs. We want, for example, the new jobs to be based on, say, ecological demands for new green, you know, aviation or whatever the example might be, and for good social employment conditions. Instead, some of the money was used to let workers go. So the lessons haven't been learned in that. So I think relaxing state rules, allowing states to lead the recovery is vitally important. But while they're prepared to do it now, it's very clear that they'll pull that back as soon as they think they can get away with it. So it's a little bit of a seesaw, and that's why I think the populations of Europe need to be very vigilant. It's difficult when they're locked behind doors in houses, but already I think we've seen through some of the unions and that have going to have to be very much centre stage on a lot of these issues. And in fairness, they have been, like, to try and seize and link some of the state investment to necessary social improvements that need to be made, or necessary environmental measures that need to be stepped in.
Just moving towards the end with some more general questions. Claire, how well do you think you know, the EU has a huge amount of, you know, the social pillar, fundamental rights, and all this sort of thing? We've got some lovely words up there. How well do you think the EU lives up to its human rights commitments? And in the context of that and your own political work, I got a question from a staff member. Actually, it's not in the chat. Why did you leave Ireland and move over to Brussels? You know, has it been a worthwhile arena to pursue your human rights advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. They lead the way in lovely words, and we often use that against them, that it's an incredibly hypocritical or institution, I suppose, institutions, because they talk the good talk, but they are found wanting in delivering so often. I think a lot of the examples that I gave at the start very graphically illustrate that situation. I mean, we've had battles with commissioners over issues like, for example, the Croatian authorities have been repeatedly receiving EU money to police the borders of Europe in their country. That money was supposed to be contingent on fundamental rights monitoring at the borders, yet the Commission had repeated evidence to show that that wasn't the case, yet they kept giving the money, because actually they were using them to keep migrants out rather than to ensure that fundamental rights were protected. And that example is replicated everywhere. In terms of my move here and whether it was worthwhile, God only knows. I suppose it's really unfortunate that COVID happened so quickly in here. There's no doubt about it that a lot of the initiatives that we could have organised in terms of events that we could have organised here, and we do have very good access to good resources and good speakers, so we could have had some really good high profile gigs where we could have discussed a lot of ideas. we would have had a lot of opportunity to bring Irish people over here to see the setup and to allow, you know, working class youth or migrant youth from Ireland to come over and see the scene. That all of that sort of went by the wayside. But was it worthwhile? Well, it's gas. I've actually found it really interesting the way other countries view the European Union and the European Parliament as distinct to Ireland, because I've been quoted in the Guardian on a whole number of occasions. I used this example before, and it sounds a bit mad, and I'm not praising myself or anything, but I actually became a household name in Bulgaria, believe it or not, the EU's poorest country, as a result of using the platform here to highlight the corruption and rights abuses that are going on in Bulgaria, which their own MEPs, practically all of the parties are involved in that corruption, and the EU is turning a blind eye to it all the time. We're ignoring. But that, I suppose, platform was being listened to by a movement of people that was on the streets for over 100 days demanding change in their government. And they were sick, and it's your point about the pillar and good words. They were hearing the EU give out about Turkey, give out about Russia, and yet their own member state was, you know, violating their rights, was siphoning off all of the EU money, was making them fat, and they were like proud of that, whereas the people weren't getting any benefit of it, and nobody in here was talking about it. But as a result of being able to tie that platform in with the movement that was there in Sofia, they actually invited me over to address the 100th day of protests, became a sensation on the thing, and that was worthwhile because it gave them a shot in the arm for their movement. There are elections now. We got a motion passed at Parliament. On one level, you could say it didn't make any difference. For those people, that made a lot of difference. It sort of made them feel they weren't alone. It gave a bit of hope. And given that alternative vision can be worthwhile. Ultimately, will it be worthwhile? I don't know. I mean, we had said that if we didn't change the place, we came to see, could we change it? Mainly because a lot of the legislation coming into Ireland was starting in Europe and nobody in Ireland knew about it. So we said, could we come over and try and change it early on? And so we said, if we didn't change it, we'd burn it. Now, I have to say, the matches are looking like the, you know, sort of preferred choice at the moment, but it's early days. There's some very good people here. There is some really, you know, good aspirations here. It's a totally contradictory situation because the EU, all that good stuff that Irish people love about it is solidarity, holidays, mixing with different people, you know, getting on with your neighbours and all that good stuff that Irish people like, is hamstrung by the fact that at its heart, it's a neoliberal project. And that neoliberalism is embedded in the law in a way in which the rights aren't. So that's the struggle that you have. But when the people of Europe get organised as the Bulgarians did, it's a good platform to tune into. And my last point on it is that Ireland doesn't cover the work here. And I'd understand how people in Ireland say you just fecked off, you're doing nothing over there, and we never hear anything from you. I would say myself and Mick Wallace have a podcast every week, I Foresee Trouble with Daly and Wallace, which covers all of the issues that we take on board there. We're doing our bit. We passed a motion to try and get a kind of an Oireachtas TV. Well, we didn't pass it. It actually failed. We nearly got it passed in the Parliament. Myself and Mick tabled the thing whereby every country would cover the work of the European Parliament. All the footage is there digitally to be able to democratise it a lot more. We lost by 2 votes and actually Fine Gael voted against it, but they are. But we'll come back to that because there needs to be covered. Ireland is an island beside another island on the periphery of Europe. We're very much away from the stuff that goes on here. But I totally accept we have a huge body of work to get that message back home. We're not doing it now, but 1 or 2 people can't do that. Institutionally, Ireland needs to change. And we actually wrote to the Minister for Communications, and all of the MEPs would agree with that. We need to have that investment here so that people at home get to hear more about it because it's impacting on them anyway.
Okay, Claire, we're coming to the end of our allotted time. Those sounded like quite good final comments, but have you anything else you want to add?
Now you do another set of final comments. No, just to say, look, total appreciation for the work that TASC always does. I was saying it to you at the start, Don, because we've been kind of stuck over here. In this past COVID year, you get a little bit out of touch with the way in which, you know, people are thinking in Ireland. I'm conscious that a lot of the information at the start and the drive that's in the EU and other member states wouldn't necessarily be the case in Ireland. It would be strange for people in Ireland to hear that, because it's not really their experience in Ireland. But it's very much the case that that is the agenda here, and that from the information we can get, when Ireland goes along to that, as in to the Council of Europe, they're playing along with that line, which I think is dangerous, because I think we have an opportunity as an independent, small, neutral country to play a different role. We can do that here. We could do that on the Security Council now as well, if we wanted to, rather than to just bend the knee to American imperialism. It doesn't have to be like that. And I think we should use our goodwill to good effect.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. Thank you very much indeed. Just to say that a full recording of the discussion today is available on our website. It's on our Facebook page, I think. And I'll just say a few words to conclude. I read recently a paper written by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And I'm more or less quoting actually from this paper he wrote, and he said that COVID-19 highlights two fundamental truths about human rights. First, human rights violations harm us all. And second, human rights are universal and protect us all. And for me, this means that in a COVID context, it's only when it's resolved globally will it really be resolved for all of us. These things are pretty obvious, but they sort of often disappear, I think, for both rich and poor countries, and for both rich and poor people in our country. And in fact, I think the COVID crisis highlights just another demonstration of how poverty and inequalities anywhere damage us all. And addressing these inequalities is the core function of TASC. To remind you also that TASC is celebrating 20 years of addressing inequality and sustaining democracy in Ireland, and that we very much depend on donations to continue to fulfil our role as the only independent and progressive think tank in Ireland. Our next guest in the TASC conversation series is Rose Conway Walsh, TD, on the 16th of April. This will be followed in May, a date still to be confirmed by Mary Lou MacDonald and Alan Kelly. So thank you all these anonymous thousands of you out there listening to our thank you all for listening. Thank you for your contributions. And of course, Claire, thank you very much in particular for slightly frightening, but I think there are channels of action. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Don. Thanks to all.
And we'll end this now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.